The Rothschilds controlled European banking, the Sassoons controlled Asian opium, but there was another Jewish family that controlled something even more powerful: your desire. At their peak, the Oppenheimers controlled 90% of the world's diamond supply. 90%. They didn't just sell diamonds. They invented the entire concept that diamonds mean love. That 2-month salary statistic? They made it up. The diamonds are forever slogan? Their advertising team. Every engagement ring tradition you think is ancient? Created in 1938 by one family's marketing department. They took a common stone, geologically more abundant than rubies or emeralds, and convinced the entire Western world it was rare, precious and essential for marriage. They manufactured scarcity, manufactured a tradition, manufactured desire, and they did it for nearly a century without anyone noticing. If you're genuinely fascinated by how power actually works, consider subscribing and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because this story touches every corner of the globe. Ernest Oppenheimer was not supposed to conquer an industry. He was supposed to be a diamond sorter in a small London office, a German Jewish immigrant grateful for whatever work he could find. Born in 1880 in the small German town of Friedberg, Ernest grew up in circumstances that gave no hint of the empire he would eventually build. His father, Edward Oppenheimer, was a cigar merchant, solidly middle class, comfortable but nowhere near wealthy. The family lived modestly, spoke German at home, observed Jewish traditions, and navigated the increasingly uncomfortable position of Jews in late 19th century Germany. Anti-Semitic restrictions were tightening. Jewish families faced limits on which professions they could enter, which businesses they could own, which social circles would accept them. Edward Oppenheimer watched these walls closing in and made a decision that would change history. He would send his sons to England to the diamond trade, where Jewish networks had operated for centuries and where talent mattered more than bloodline. In 1896, Ernest arrived in London at age 16, knowing almost no one, speaking accented English, carrying a letter of introduction to a firm called Dunkelsbühler and Company. This was a German Jewish diamond trading house, one node in a network that stretched across continents. The diamond trade had been dominated by the Jewish merchants since medieval times, not by choice but by necessity. Christian rulers had forbidden Jews from owning land, practicing most crafts, joining guilds. Gem trading was one of the few occupations left open to them. Over centuries, this restriction became an advantage. Jewish families developed expertise in evaluating stones, built trust networks spanning Amsterdam to Antwerp to London to Cape Town, created systems of handshake deals sealed with the Hebrew phrase mazal u'braka, luck and blessing, that moved millions in diamonds without written contracts. Ernest started at the absolute bottom. His job was sorting rough diamonds, sitting at a wooden table with tweezers and a loupe, separating stones by quality, size, colour, clarity. Hundreds of stones per day, thousands per week, each one examined under harsh light, categorised, graded. Most young men found this work tedious. Ernest found it mesmerising. He had a gift. Within months, his supervisors noticed that his grading decisions matched those of evaluators with decades more experience. He could glance at a stone and estimate its value within 5%. He understood diamonds the way some people understand music, intuitively, completely, at a level that could not really be taught. By age 20, Ernest was handling significant client relationships. By 22, Dunkelsbühler made him an offer that would define his life. They wanted to send him to South Africa, to Kimberley, to represent the firm at the source of the diamonds themselves. When Ernest stepped off the train in Kimberley in 1902, he entered a world unlike anything London had prepared him for. Kimberley was chaos. It was dust and heat and violence and opportunity compressed into a few square miles of African earth. The big hole dominated everything, a massive pit carved into the ground by human hands, the largest hand-dug excavation in history, nearly 500 metres across and dropping into darkness. Thousands of workers, almost all of them black African men, labouring under conditions closer to slavery than employment, crawled over the slopes extracting diamonds that would adorn European aristocrats. The streets around the mine were filled with fortune seekers, conmen, prostitutes, engineers, merchants, all drawn by the glitter of stones pulled from the ground. De Beers consolidated mines already existed. Cecil Rhodes had amalgamated the smaller claims into a single company over the previous 2 decades. But Rhodes had just died that year, 1902, and his vision for De Beers remained incomplete. The company was powerful but not yet monopolistic. Competitors still operated, independent diggers still sold on the open market. And this created a problem that Ernest identified almost immediately. The diamond market was insane. Prices lurched up and down unpredictably. When new deposits were discovered or production increased, prices crashed. When supply tightened, prices spiked. Nobody was coordinating anything. Each producer competed against every other producer, flooding the market, destroying value for everyone. Ernest watched this dysfunction and saw something others missed. The problem was not competition. The problem was the absence of control. Diamonds were not actually rare. Geologically, they were far more common than rubies or emeralds. The only thing that made them valuable was the belief that they were scarce. And belief could be managed. Supply could be controlled. If one entity could control enough of the diamond supply, they could set prices at whatever level they wanted. They could create artificial scarcity. They could make a common stone seem precious simply by deciding how many stones reached the market. Rhodes had understood this partially. Ernest saw the full picture. In 1906, Ernest married Mary Pollack, daughter of one of Kimberley's prominent families. She was accomplished and connected, her relatives embedded in the social networks that a German Jewish newcomer could not easily penetrate. The marriage was genuine. Ernest and Mary would remain devoted partners for decades, but it was also strategic in ways that would become a family pattern. Mary opened doors. Her family vouched for Ernest to people who would otherwise have dismissed him as a foreigner, a trader not quite the right sort. Through Mary, Ernest gained access to the clubs, the dinner parties, the informal conversations where real business happened in colonial South Africa. He began quietly acquiring small mining claims, buying out struggling diggers, accumulating stakes in companies that seemed insignificant individually, but together represented real control over diamond-bearing land. He was not yet ready to challenge De Beers directly. That would require capital and power he did not possess. But he was laying groundwork, building networks, learning everything about how the industry actually functioned. And in his mind, an idea was taking shape that would eventually transform the entire global diamond trade. Diamonds are not valuable because they are rare, Ernest wrote in a letter during this period. They are valuable because we can make them seem rare. This was the foundation philosophy that would guide everything the Oppenheimers built. Rhodes had understood supply control. Ernest saw something beyond supply. He saw that you could control demand too. You could shape what people wanted, convince them they needed something they had never previously desired, manufacture traditions from nothing. Control supply and demand simultaneously, and you would not just dominate an industry. You would own human desire itself. But controlling the diamond supply required controlling De Beers. And De Beers was run by British aristocrats who had no intention of letting a German Jewish immigrant anywhere near the boardroom. Ernest Oppenheimer would need 15 years, 2 world wars, and the largest gold discovery in history to change their minds. In 1917, while Europe tore itself apart in trenches, Ernest Oppenheimer was building an empire in the African goldfields. The war that killed millions would make him one of the richest men on earth. The diamond market had collapsed almost overnight when war broke out in 1914. European aristocrats who had been the primary customers for luxury stones suddenly had other concerns. Young men who might have bought engagement rings were dying in the mud of Flanders. The great houses of Europe were in mourning, not celebration. Diamond prices fell by half, then fell again. Mines closed. Workers were laid off. The industry that Ernest had spent 15 years mastering seemed to be dying. Most diamond men panicked. Ernest saw opportunity, just not in diamonds. Gold was a different story entirely. The war had created insatiable demand for the metal. Every nation needed gold to back its currency, to finance its military, to purchase supplies from neutral countries that demanded payment in something more reliable than paper promises. The price of gold was fixed by international agreement, but the demand was limitless. Whoever could produce gold could sell every ounce at guaranteed prices, and South Africa contained the richest gold deposits ever discovered on Earth. The Witwatersrand Basin, a geological formation stretching across the Transvaal, held more gold than anywhere else in the world. The problem was access. British mining companies controlled the major operations. They had arrived decades earlier, established claims, built infrastructure, and created an interlocking system of ownership that excluded outsiders. Ernest was still an outsider. His success in the diamond trade meant nothing to the gold establishment. They had their own networks, their own families, their own ways of doing business. But Ernest had something they lacked. He had connections to American capital. The United States was growing rich from the war, selling supplies to the Allies while staying out of the fighting. American financiers had money to invest and were looking for opportunities outside their own country. Ernest travelled to New York in 1917 and presented his vision to the partners at J.P. Morgan and Company. He proposed creating a new mining corporation that would consolidate smaller gold operations in South Africa, introduce modern management techniques and generate returns that would dwarf anything available in American markets. The Americans were interested but cautious. They wanted to know who would run this operation, who would protect their investment, who would ensure that their money was not swallowed by the chaos of wartime Africa. Ernest made his pitch with the confidence of a man who had spent 2 decades preparing for exactly this moment. He knew the mines, he knew the labour systems, he knew the politics, he knew how to extract value from African soil, and critically, he knew how to present himself as something he was not. The company he founded was called the Anglo-American Corporation of South Africa. Notice what is missing from that name. There is no mention of Germany, no hint of Jewish heritage, nothing that would trigger the anti-German hysteria that had gripped the Allied nations during the war. Anglo-American sounded British and American, respectable and reliable, exactly the kind of company that London bankers and New York financiers would trust with their money. The name was a lie, or at least a careful misdirection. Ernest Oppenheimer was neither Anglo nor American. He was a German Jew who had been living in South Africa for 15 years. But names matter, perceptions matter. Yes. And Ernest understood that controlling perception was just as important as controlling production. The initial investment was approximately $1 million, equivalent to roughly $25 million in today's currency. J.P. Morgan provided the capital, Ernest provided the expertise and operational control. The deal structure was elegant. Americans got profits and dividends. Ernest got power. He would run the company, make the decisions, determine strategy. The financiers in New York would receive their returns and leave him alone to build whatever he wanted to build. Within 3 years, Anglo-American had transformed from a startup into one of South Africa's largest mining companies. Ernest moved with ruthless efficiency. He identified struggling gold operations, offered to buy them at prices that seemed generous to desperate sellers, then consolidated them into larger, more efficient units. He introduced scientific mining techniques that European engineers had developed, but African operations had been slow to adopt. He vertically integrated, controlling not just the mines but the processing facilities, the transportation networks, the supply chains. Every link in the chain that Ernest controlled was a link where value could not leak out to competitors. Profits that might have gone to independent contractors or middlemen flowed instead into Anglo-American accounts. And Ernest reinvested those profits immediately, buying more properties, expanding operations, building an empire at a pace that stunned the established mining houses. By 1920, Anglo-American was generating profits that exceeded many of its older competitors. The gold that financed World War I was flowing through Ernest Oppenheimer's company, and every ounce that passed through his hands left a residue of wealth that accumulated into something approaching real power. Now Ernest could finally pursue what he had wanted all along. De Beers, the diamond company that Cecil Rhodes had built, remained the dominant force in the industry, but it was no longer the aggressive, innovative enterprise it had been under Rhodes. The men who ran it in 20 were administrators, not empire builders. They were British establishment figures, products of the right schools and the right families, who viewed their positions as inherited privileges rather than competitive advantages. They managed De Beers the way aristocrats managed country estates, collecting rents and dividends while assuming that the natural order of things would continue indefinitely. Ernest represented everything these men disdained. He was an immigrant, he was Jewish, he was a trader, a man who had worked with his hands sorting diamonds, a man who had scrambled for every advantage rather than inheriting his position. The British directors of De Beers would never have invited Ernest Oppenheimer to dinner, much less to their boardroom, but Ernest did not need an invitation. He had money. Anglos. Americans' gold profits generated cash that had to go somewhere, and Ernest began directing that cash toward De Beers stock. Quietly, methodically, through intermediaries and shell companies, he accumulated shares. Each purchase was small enough to avoid attention. Together, they represented a growing stake in the company that had dismissed him as beneath consideration. The British establishment watched with horror as they realised what was happening. This outsider, this German Jew, this trader was buying his way into their company. They tried to block him, tried to find allies who would purchase shares to keep them out of Oppenheimer hands, tried to change corporate rules to limit his influence. None of it worked. Money talks, and Ernest had more money than they did. His gold profits could absorb any defensive measure they attempted. Every share they bought to keep away from him simply drove up the price, making his existing holdings more valuable. By the mid-1920s, Ernest controlled enough De Beers stock to demand a seat on the board. The directors had no legal basis to refuse. He was a major shareholder. He had every right to representation. They gave him his seat with visible contempt, assuming they could marginalise him in committee meetings and procedural manoeuvres. They underestimated him completely. Ernest Oppenheimer's outsider status was not a weakness. It was his greatest advantage. He had no loyalty to the existing arrangements that the British directors considered sacred. He had no social obligations to the families who had run the diamond industry for generations. He had no sentimental attachment to the way things had always been done. He could see the industry clearly because he was not blinded by traditional privilege. And he had something else the establishment lacked. He had hunger. The British directors were rich already. Their families had been rich for generations. They wanted to preserve what they had, not risk it on aggressive expansion. Ernest had built everything himself, from nothing, against opposition, through sheer force of will and intelligence. He knew what it took to create wealth because he had done it. He knew what it took to defeat entrenched opponents because he had done that too. The establishment families had inherited their positions. Ernest had conquered his. There was another advantage that the British directors could not match. Ernest remained connected to the Jewish trading networks that had dominated the diamond industry for centuries. These networks operated on trust, on family relationships, on shared history and shared vulnerability. They passed information through channels that outsiders could not access. When a new diamond deposit was discovered, when a competitor was struggling, when a market was shifting, Ernest heard about it through his networks before the official reports reached De Beers' headquarters. The British directors relied on formal intelligence gathering, on reports from company agents, on the slow movement of official information through bureaucratic channels. Ernest knew things they did not know, and he knew them faster. Year by year, board meeting by board meeting, Ernest expanded his influence within De Beers. He proposed initiatives that made money. He identified inefficiencies that were costing the company profits. He demonstrated competence so overwhelming that even directors who despised him personally could not argue with his results. The other board members slowly came to depend on his analysis, his judgment, his understanding of how the diamond market actually functioned. In 1929, Ernest Oppenheimer finally got what he had spent 15 years pursuing: the chairmanship of De Beers. He was 49 years old. He had conquered the company. Now he would do something far more ambitious. He would conquer human desire itself. The Great Depression destroyed fortunes, bankrupted nations, and drove millions into poverty. Ernest Oppenheimer's response? He bought everything. The stock market crash of 1929 devastated the diamond industry more thoroughly than even the World War had done. Luxury goods demand did not merely decline, it evaporated. The wealthy families who had purchased diamonds for generations suddenly found themselves scrambling to preserve whatever assets remained. Nobody was buying engagement rings when banks were failing. Nobody was celebrating with jewellery when unemployment was reaching 25%. Diamond prices collapsed so completely that mines which had operated profitably for decades could no longer cover their costs. One by one, diamond operations around the world began shutting down. Mining companies that had seemed invincible declared bankruptcy. Families that had controlled diamond production for generations found themselves forced to sell at whatever price they could get. Most observers saw catastrophe. Ernest Oppenheimer saw the opportunity of a lifetime. While other businessmen were hoarding cash and waiting for the storm to pass, Ernest went shopping. Anglo-American gold operations continued generating profits even through the Depression. Gold was a safe haven asset. When everything else collapsed, people fled to gold. The same economic disaster that destroyed diamond demand actually increased gold demand, and Ernest had positioned himself perfectly to benefit. Those gold profits became the war chest for the most ambitious acquisition spree in mining history. Ernest sent agents to every struggling diamond operation on Earth. His instructions were simple. Make offers, make them now. Desperate sellers have no leverage. and every diamond producer on the planet was desperate. Mines in South Africa that had resisted De Beers' control for decades suddenly found themselves unable to make payroll. Ernest offered to buy them at fractions of their previous valuations. The owners could accept his price or watch their operations collapse entirely. They accepted, the same pattern repeated across continents. In Southwest Africa, now Namibia, German colonial mining operations faced ruin as their European markets disappeared. Ernest acquired them. In Angola, Portuguese colonial authorities had granted concessions to independent mining companies that now could not find buyers for their stones. Ernest contracted to purchase their entire output at prices he dictated. In the Belgian Congo, diamond operations that had supplied European cutters for decades found those cutters going bankrupt. Ernest stepped in as the only buyer with cash. In Brazil, in West Africa, in every corner of the globe where diamonds emerged from the earth, Ernest Oppenheimer or his agents appeared with checkbooks and contracts. Each acquisition was individually reasonable. A struggling company sold to a buyers with capital. That happens in every economic downturn. But the cumulative effect was something unprecedented. By the mid-1930s, Ernest Oppenheimer had assembled control over the vast majority of global diamond production. What had been a fragmented industry of competing miners and traders became something closer to a single organism with Ernest at its head. But acquisition was only half of Ernest's vision. Controlling production meant nothing if producers could still sell independently, if buyers could still shop around, if market forces could still determine prices. Ernest needed a mechanism that would transform his collection of mining interests into absolute market control. In 1934, he created that mechanism. He called it the Central Selling Organization. The name sounds bureaucratic, almost boring. The reality was revolutionary. The CSO was the single channel through which virtually all rough diamonds on Earth would flow. Every mining company that Ernest controlled or contracted was required to sell 100% of their production to the CSO. Not 90%, not most of their output, every single stone. The CSO would then sort these diamonds, grade them, and offer them to approved buyers at prices the so determined. The buyers were called site holders. They were the major diamond cutting and trading houses, the firms that transformed rough stones into polished gems. To become a site holder was to gain access to the global diamond supply. To lose site holder status was to be cut off from that supply entirely. The system worked through a process called a site. 10 times per year, site holders would travel to London and present themselves at the CSO offices. They would be escorted to a private room where a small box waited for them. Inside the box was an assortment of rough diamonds. The CSO had selected these stones for this particular buyer, determined the quantities, set the price. The site holder had exactly 2 options: accept the entire contents of the box at the stated price, or refuse and never be invited back. There was no negotiation, there was no examination of alternatives, there was no haggling over quality or disputing. Valuations. The CSO told you what you were buying and what you were paying. Your only choice was yes or no, and no meant permanent exile from the diamond trade. This system sounds impossible. How could buyers accept such terms? The answer is that they had no alternative. The CSO controlled virtually all rough diamond supply worldwide. If you wanted to be in the diamond business, you needed rough diamonds. If you needed rough diamonds, you needed the CSO. And the CSO would only deal with buyers who accepted their terms completely. The few firms that objected, that demanded better treatment, that tried to negotiate, simply found themselves removed from the site holder list. Their competitors, the firms that accepted CSO terms without complaint, received larger allocations. Within a few years, the objectors were out of business. The compliant firms prospered. The market taught everyone the lesson Ernest intended. Cooperate or die. The system made diamond pricing completely artificial. Prices bore no relationship to production costs, to geological scarcity, to consumer demand, to any of the factors that normally determine what things cost. Diamond prices were whatever Ernest Oppenheimer decided they should be. If he wanted prices higher, the CSO released fewer stones. If he wanted to maintain a particular price point, the CSO held supply constant regardless of what happened in the broader economy. The invisible hand of the market had been replaced by the very visible hand of one man. But even total control of current production was not enough. What happened when someone discovered a new diamond deposit? What happened when existing mines produced more than the market could absorb at the prices Ernest wanted to maintain? What happened when economic conditions created temporary surpluses? The answer was the stockpile. De Beers maintained enormous diamond reserves in vaults beneath the London offices. The exact contents of these vaults were among the most closely guarded secrets in the business world. Estimates suggested the stockpile was worth billions of dollars, equivalent to years of global production, a mountain of crystallized carbon sitting in darkness waiting to be deployed. The stockpile served as the ultimate market control mechanism. When production exceeded the amount Ernest wanted to release, the excess went into the vault. When a new mine was discovered, De Beers would either acquire it outright or contract for its output, then stockpile whatever production exceeded demand. When economic conditions weakened and buyers wanted fewer stones, the CSO simply purchased more for the stockpile, maintaining prices by absorbing supply that would otherwise flood the market. The stockpile also served as a weapon. Any producer who attempted to sell outside the CSO system faced a simple threat. De Beers could release stockpiled diamonds onto the market, flooding the particular category that the independent seller was trying to market, crashing prices so completely that the rebel would be destroyed. It did not matter if this strategy cost De Beers money in the short term. The stockpile was so vast that De Beers could sustain losses that would bankrupt any competitor. Everyone in the industry knew this. Everyone understood what would happen to anyone who defied the system. This knowledge alone was usually enough to ensure compliance. The enforcement mechanisms were rarely visible because they rarely needed to be used. Reputation did the work. Stories circulated about traders who had tried to operate outside CSO channels, about the financial destruction that followed, about careers ended and fortunes lost. Some of these stories were true, some were probably exaggerated. It did not matter. The perception of De Beers' power was itself a form of power. When everyone believes that defiance means destruction, almost no one defies. The few who did test the system discovered the stories were not exaggerated. Buyers who purchased diamonds outside CSO channels found themselves blacklisted, not just from future sites, but from the broader diamond trading community. Banks that had financed their operations suddenly called in loans. Insurance companies cancelled policies. Business partners received quiet suggestions that association with the blacklisted firm might affect their own CSO relationships. The pressure was rarely direct, rarely traceable to De Beers specifically. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a systemic immune response that identified and eliminated threats to the organism. De Beers maintained intelligence networks that tracked every significant diamond transaction worldwide. Agents in cutting centres reported on which firms were buying from whom. Informants in mining regions identified stones that might be reaching the market outside official channels. The information flowed to London, was analysed, and responses were coordinated. If a parcel of diamonds appeared in Antwerp that had not passed through the CSO, De Beers knew within days. The seller would be identified, warned, and if necessary, destroyed. By 1938, Ernest Oppenheimer had achieved control over approximately 90% of global rough diamond supply. 90%. Think about that figure. One organisation, ultimately controlled by one family, determined the price and availability of nearly every diamond on Earth. Nothing comparable existed in any other industry. Standard Oil at its peak had controlled perhaps 70% of American oil refining. The great trusts and monopolies that governments had spent decades fighting had never achieved the market dominance that De Beers held quietly, legally, without significant regulatory interference. The map of world diamond production had become the map of Oppenheimer control. South African mines that produced the bulk of gem-quality stones operated under direct De Beers ownership. Southwest African coastal deposits fed directly into the CSO system. Angolan production, extracted by Portuguese colonial operations, flowed through De Beers purchasing agreements. Belgian Congo diamonds, pulled from the jungle by African labourers under brutal colonial supervision, passed through CSO sorting facilities before reaching cutters. Brazilian stones, West African alluvials, production from wherever diamonds emerged from the earth, all of it converged on London, on the CSO offices, on the decisions made by Ernest Oppenheimer and his subordinates. The system was elegant in its completeness. Mining companies received stable prices regardless of market fluctuations, which made them dependent on the system continuing. Site holders received reliable supply at predictable costs, which made them invested in the system's preservation. banks and insurers built their risk models around CSO stability, which gave them incentive to pressure anyone who threatened that stability. Governments received tax revenues from profitable operations in their territories, which made them reluctant to investigate whether those profits resulted from illegal market manipulation. Everyone benefited from cooperation. Everyone faced costs from defection. The cartel was self-sustaining, self-enforcing, self-perpetuating. Ernest Oppenheimer had engineered not just a business but an economic ecosystem that rewarded compliance and punished independence. By 1938, Ernest Oppenheimer had achieved something unprecedented: absolute control over a global commodity. But control of supply meant nothing if demand collapsed. Europe was heading toward war. Diamond sales were plummeting. The Oppenheimers needed to create demand that did not exist. They needed to make people want diamonds who had never wanted them before. And for that, they turned to Madison Avenue. Everything you believe about diamonds, that they are rare, that they mean love, that engagement rings are ancient tradition, was invented by an advertising agency in 1938. This is the most successful marketing campaign in human history. By the late 1930s, Ernest Oppenheimer faced a problem that all his supply control could not solve. He had achieved near total dominance over diamond production. He had built the most effective cartel the world had ever seen. He could set prices at whatever level he chose, but none of that mattered if nobody wanted to buy diamonds, and in 1938 almost nobody did. Diamond sales had collapsed throughout the Depression years. The European aristocracy that had traditionally purchased large stones was facing extinction, their fortunes destroyed by war and economic catastrophe, their social world crumbling. The American market, which should have been the future of diamond sales, barely existed. Here is a fact that will surprise you. In 1938, only about 10% of American engagement rings contained diamonds. 10%. The diamond engagement ring was not a widespread American tradition. It was not something that most couples expected or desired. Most American women receive engagement rings with other stones, sapphires, rubies, or no stone at all. Many received no engagement ring whatsoever. The idea that a diamond ring was essential to engagement, that proposing without a diamond was somehow inadequate or unromantic, simply did not exist in American culture. The tradition you think is ancient, the tradition your grandmother probably followed, the tradition you may have followed yourself, had not yet been invented. Ernest Oppenheimer controlled the supply of a product that people did not particularly want. He could restrict diamonds to create artificial scarcity, but scarcity means nothing if the scarce thing is not desired. You can restrict the supply of anything. You could restrict the supply of pebbles or bottle caps or dead leaves. Restriction alone does not create value. Desire creates value, and Americans did not desire diamonds. De Beers needed to manufacture that desire from nothing. In 1938, Ernest Oppenheimer hired N.W. Ayer & Son, one of the most prestigious advertising agencies in America. The firm had been operating since 1869, had built campaigns for major American corporations, and had a reputation for sophisticated, psychologically informed marketing. The brief Ernest gave them was unprecedented. Do not advertise De Beers. Do not advertise any particular diamond product or retailer. Instead, advertise the concept of diamonds themselves. Make Americans want diamonds. Make them believe that diamonds are essential to romance, to love, to the proper expression of commitment. Create demand that does not currently exist. The N.W. Ayer team approached this challenge with remarkable insight. They understood that direct advertising would not work. You could not simply tell Americans that they should want diamonds and expect them to comply. The message had to be absorbed unconsciously, had to feel like a natural cultural development rather than a commercial manipulation. They needed to make Americans believe that desiring diamonds was their own idea, arising from their own values rather than something imposed by a South African mining company. The strategy they developed was documented in internal memos that would later become famous among marketing historians. The goal, they wrote, was to strengthen the tradition of the diamond engagement ring, to make it a psychological necessity capable of competing with utility goods and services. Notice the language. Strengthen the tradition. There was no tradition to strengthen. They were creating one from scratch while pretending to reinforce something that already existed. The campaign would link diamond size to the depth of romantic love. Larger diamonds would signify deeper commitment. Smaller diamonds, or no diamonds at all, would suggest inadequate love. This created a psychological trap. What man wanted to signal to his beloved, and to everyone who saw her ring, that his love was small and cheap? What woman wanted to wear evidence that her fiancé had not valued her sufficiently? The diamond became a public measure of private emotion, and everyone would be judged by its size. The genius of the campaign was that it never mentioned De Beers. It never mentioned any company at all. The advertisements, the planted stories, the cultural messaging all promoted the idea of diamonds generically. Every diamond purchase, regardless of retailer, regardless of source, served De Beers' interests because De Beers controlled virtually all supply. They were advertising for an entire industry in which they held a monopoly. Every competitor who benefited from increased diamond demand was actually working for Ernest Oppenheimer. NWA targeted Hollywood with systematic precision. They understood that movies shaped American aspirations, that audiences absorbed values and desires from what they saw on screen. The agency arranged for diamonds to appear in films, worked with costume designers to ensure that leading ladies wore diamond jewelry in romantic scenes, coordinated with studios to emphasize diamond engagement rings in proposal sequences. They did not pay for product placement in any direct way that audiences might recognize as advertising. Instead, they cultivated relationships with studio personnel, provided diamonds on loan for productions, and made it easy and attractive for filmmakers to include diamonds in their visual vocabulary. The movie stars themselves became unwitting endorsers. NWA provided diamonds to celebrities for publicity photographs, for red carpet appearances, for magazine features. They fed stories to gossip columnists about celebrity engagement rings, emphasizing the size and quality of the diamonds involved. When a famous actress became engaged, NWA worked to ensure that her diamond ring received prominent coverage, creating the impression that diamonds were what glamorous, desirable women expected and received. The visual language we now associate with proposals, the man kneeling, the small box revealed, the woman gasping with surprise and joy at the sparkling stone, was systematically constructed through decades of repetition in films, advertisements, and magazine features. This imagery did not reflect existing American customs, it created new customs. Young Americans watching these scenes absorbed the message that this was how romance worked, this was what love looked like, this was what they should expect and provide. It was cultural programming disguised as entertainment, advertising so subtle that it did not register as advertising at all. By the late 1940s, the campaign was succeeding beyond anything Ernest Oppenheimer had anticipated. Diamond engagement ring sales had increased dramatically, but NWA was not finished. They had solved the problem of the initial demand. Now they needed to solve another problem, one that threatened the entire De Beers pricing structure. The secondary market. Diamonds are durable. They do not wear out or decay. A diamond purchased in 1920 is physically identical to a diamond mined yesterday. This creates a problem for anyone trying to control diamond prices. Every diamond ever sold still exists. Every diamond in every drawer, every estate, every pawn shop represents potential supply that could enter the market and compete with new production. If people regularly resold their diamonds, if a robust secondary market developed, all of Ernest Oppenheimer's supply control would be undermined by the millions of stones already in circulation. De Beers needed to prevent resale. They needed to convince people to keep their diamonds forever, to never even consider selling them, to view the idea of selling a diamond as somehow shameful or inappropriate. In 1948, a copywriter at NWA named Frances Geraghty was working late, struggling to find a slogan for the De Beers account. She later said she was tired and irritable, just wanted to finish and go home. She scrawled a phrase on a piece of paper and submitted it without much enthusiasm. "A diamond is forever." Her supervisors initially dismissed it. The phrase was grammatically awkward. "Diamonds are forever" would have been more correct. But something about the slightly unusual construction made it memorable, made it feel like an ancient proverb rather than a new advertisement. The slogan was tested, refined, and launched. It became one of the most successful advertising phrases ever created. Advertising Age would later name it the slogan of the century, ahead of campaigns for Coca-Cola, Nike, and McDonald's. The strategic brilliance of "A diamond is forever" operated on multiple levels. On the surface, it connected diamonds to eternal love, suggesting that the stone would last as long as the commitment it represented. But beneath that romantic message was a commercial purpose. If a diamond is forever, you do not sell it. You do not trade it for cash when times are hard. You do not pass it along to a second-hand dealer who might put it back on the market. You keep it forever. The phrase transformed diamonds from luxury purchases into sacred objects, items that could not be commodified or exchanged without betraying their emotional significance. Selling your diamond became equivalent to selling your love, to admitting that your commitment was not actually eternal. The secondary market that threatened De Beers' pricing power was neutralized by making resale emotionally unthinkable. The phrase embedded itself so deeply in Western culture that most people assume it is ancient wisdom, something humans have always believed about diamonds. It is not. It was written by a tired copywriter in 1948, specifically designed to prevent you from ever selling your diamond back into the market. The campaign continued evolving in subsequent decades. N.W. Ayer and later agencies working for De Beers introduced additional elements designed to maximize diamond purchases. The most insidious was the salary rule. At various points, De Beers' advertising suggested that a man should spend 1 month's salary on an engagement ring. Later, this became 2 months' salary. The specific number varied by market and time period, but the concept remained constant. There was an appropriate amount to spend on a diamond, and that amount was defined not by what you could afford or what seemed reasonable, but by a formula that linked spending to income. The salary rule was pure psychological manipulation. It created a benchmark that made any specific price seem justified. If 2 months' salary was the standard, then a $5,000 ring was not expensive if you earned $30,000 per year. You were simply meeting the minimum acceptable level. Spending less was not frugality. It was inadequacy. It was failing to love your partner sufficiently. It was public evidence that you did not value her as much as other men valued their fiancés. The rule also created upward pressure on spending. 2 months' salary was presented as the minimum, not the maximum. Spending more demonstrated exceptional love. Men competed with each other, consciously or not, through the size of the diamonds they purchased. Women compared rings, consciously or not, and drew conclusions about the relative depth of their partner's commitments. The salary rule has no basis in tradition, in history, in logic, or in any financial principle. It was invented by an advertising agency to sell more expensive diamonds. It is now treated as common knowledge, repeated by jewelers, cited in wedding planning guides, accepted as simply how these things work. Most people who follow the rule have no idea they are following a marketing campaign. They believe they are following their hearts. The results of the De Beers marketing efforts were staggering. In 1938, about 10% of American engagement rings contained diamonds. By 1965, that figure had risen to 80%. De Beers had not merely increased sales, they had transformed American culture. They had taken a minority practice and made it nearly universal. They had created a tradition from nothing and convinced an entire nation that the tradition was ancient and natural. But America was just the beginning. As American cultural influence spread globally through movies, television, and music, the diamond engagement ring spread with it. Countries that had no tradition of diamond engagement rings at all adopted the practice within a single generation. Japan is the most dramatic example. In 1967, fewer than 5% of Japanese brides received diamond engagement rings. Japanese culture had its own engagement traditions that did not involve diamonds or rings of any kind. Within 20 years, over 60% of Japanese brides received diamond engagement rings. An entire nation's romantic customs were overwritten by De Beers marketing, filtered through American cultural exports. The same pattern repeated in Brazil, in Germany, in Italy, in dozens of countries where diamonds had never been traditional elements of engagement or marriage. De Beers did not merely sell diamonds, they sold an idea, and the idea proved more powerful than any cultural tradition it encountered. The ultimate achievement was invisibility. The most effective propaganda is propaganda that nobody recognizes as propaganda. De Beers created demand for diamonds so successfully that the demand feels natural, feels like an expression of genuine human emotion rather than a response to corporate manipulation. People who buy diamond engagement rings do not feel marketed to. They feel they are following their hearts, expressing their love, participating in timeless rituals that connect them to generations past and future. The manufactured tradition became indistinguishable from authentic tradition. The cultural programming was complete. The Oppenheimers had achieved the impossible. They had created demand from nothing, turned a common stone into a symbol of eternal love, and convinced billions of people that a marketing campaign was ancient tradition. But maintaining the illusion required something darker: absolute control over African nations, alliances with brutal regimes, and a willingness to profit from human suffering that would define the next 3 decades of the diamond trade. Harry Oppenheimer inherited an empire built on controlling supply and manufacturing desire. He expanded that empire across newly independent African nations, signing deals with dictators, funding wars, and turning a blind eye to horrors that made his diamonds possible. Ernest Oppenheimer died in 1957, having built the most comprehensive commodity monopoly in modern history. His son Harry Frederick Oppenheimer assumed control at age 49, inheriting not just De Beers, but also Anglo-American Corporation, the gold mining giant that his father had created to finance the diamond conquest. Harry was a different kind of Oppenheimer than his father. Where Ernest had been an immigrant striver, a man who had clawed his way up from diamond sorter to chairman through sheer determination, Harry had been groomed for leadership from birth. He attended Oxford University, absorbed British upper-class manners, developed a polish and sophistication that his father had never possessed. He spoke with an accent that betrayed no trace of his German-Jewish origins. He moved comfortably in aristocratic circles that would have excluded his father. He looked and sounded like British establishment, and the British establishment that had once resisted the Oppenheimer takeover of De Beers now accepted Harry as one of their own. But beneath the cultivated exterior, Harry was every bit as ruthless as Ernest. He understood that maintaining the diamond cartel required constant vigilance, constant adaptation, constant willingness to do whatever was necessary to preserve control. The polished manners were a tool, not a constraint. When business required hard decisions, Harry made them without sentiment. The combined empire he inherited was vast, beyond anything Ernest had imagined when he first arrived in Kimberley. De Beers controlled roughly 90% of global rough diamond supply. Anglo-American dominated South African gold production and had expanded into coal, copper, uranium, and dozens of other minerals. Together, the two companies represented perhaps the largest concentration of mining wealth on Earth, and Harry Oppenheimer controlled both. The challenge he faced in 1957 was maintaining that control in a world that was rapidly changing. Africa was decolonizing. The European empires that had carved up the continent, that had established the legal frameworks and power structures that allowed companies like De Beers to operate, were collapsing. Ghana gained independence in 1957, Guinea in 1958, the Belgian Congo in 1960. Country after country threw off colonial rule, and each independence movement represented a potential threat to Oppenheimer interests. Colonial arrangements had given De Beers access to diamond deposits across Africa. Belgian colonial authorities had granted concessions in the Congo. Portuguese colonial administrators had facilitated operations in Angola. British colonial governments had provided favourable treatment throughout southern Africa. These arrangements depended on European control. When African nations became independent, new governments could nationalise mines, cancel concessions, demand renegotiated terms, or simply expel foreign companies entirely. Harry watched liberation movements sweep across the continent and recognised that the old model was finished. He could not rely on European colonial power to secure access to African diamonds. He needed new arrangements with new rulers. His response was ruthlessly pragmatic. De Beers would deal with whoever controlled the diamonds. It did not matter if that person was democratically elected, had seized power through military coup, or ruled through terror and murder. What mattered was maintaining supply control. Ideology was irrelevant. Legitimacy was irrelevant. Human rights were irrelevant. The only relevant question was whether the person in power would sign contracts that kept diamonds flowing through De Beers channels. The Democratic Republic of Congo, then called Zaire, provides the clearest example of how this approach worked in practice. Congo contained some of the richest diamond deposits in Africa, alluvial fields that had been producing gems since Belgian colonization. When Congo gained independence in 1960, chaos followed. Political factions fought for control. The mineral-rich Katanga province attempted to secede. The United Nations intervened. The country seemed to be falling apart. In 1965, a military officer named Mobutu Sese Seko seized power in a coup backed by Western intelligence agencies. Mobutu would go on to become one of the most corrupt and brutal dictators in African history. He renamed the country Zaire, renamed himself Mobutu Sese Seko Kuku Angbendu wa Zabanga, and proceeded, to loot his nation with breathtaking thoroughness. Over 3 decades of rule, Mobutu stole an estimated $5 billion from Zaire, roughly equivalent to the country's entire national debt. He maintained power through murder, torture, and terror. His security forces killed thousands of political opponents. His economic policies impoverished millions. He built palaces for himself while his people starved. Harry Oppenheimer made deals with Mobutu. De Beers negotiated agreements to access Zairean diamond production, providing the dictator with revenue that helped sustain his regime. The specific terms were confidential, but the pattern was clear. De Beers provided market access and premium prices. Mobutu provided diamonds and stability. Both parties benefited from the arrangement. The Zairian people, whose resources were being extracted and whose country was being destroyed, benefited not at all. De Beers did not create Mobutu. The company did not install him in power or direct his policies, but De Beers provided revenue that kept the regime functioning. Every diamond pulled from Zairian soil and sold through De Beers channels generated profits that flowed partly to Mobutu, that funded his security apparatus, that enabled his continued rule. De Beers was not responsible for Mobutu's crimes, but De Beers profited from them, and those profits were built into the price of every diamond sold to Western consumers who had no idea their purchases were connected to a murderous kleptocracy. This pattern repeated across the African continent. In Angola, De Beers navigated a brutal civil war that lasted decades, making arrangements with various factions as military fortunes shifted. In Sierra Leone, in Liberia, in Central African Republic, wherever diamonds emerged from the earth, De Beers found ways to bring them into the cartel system regardless of the political context. The company dealt with colonial administrators when colonies existed, with independence leaders when nations were born, with military junta and dictators when armies seized power, with anyone who could deliver diamonds. The ideological alignments of the Cold War made these arrangements even more complex. The Soviet Union, America's great adversary in the global struggle between capitalism and communism, made a discovery in the 1950s that threatened everything the Oppenheimers had built. Soviet geologists found massive diamond deposits in Siberia in a region called Yakutia. The frozen wastelands of northern Russia contained diamond pipes comparable to anything in Africa. If the Soviets developed these deposits and sold diamonds independently on the world market, they could undercut De Beers prices, destroy the cartel's control, and collapse the entire artificial pricing structure that made the Oppenheimer fortune possible. Harry Oppenheimer faced a choice. He could fight the Soviets, try to prevent them from accessing world markets, accept that diamond prices might collapse as new supply flooded in, or he could make a deal. In 1963, De Beers and the Soviet Union reached an agreement that would remain secret for decades. The Soviets would sell their diamond production through De Beers. The capitalist monopoly would market communist diamonds. Cold War enemies would become business partners, united by shared interest in maintaining high diamond prices. The arrangement was astonishing. The Soviet Union publicly denounced Western capitalism, funded revolutionary movements across the globe, built nuclear weapons aimed at American cities, and taught its children that the capitalist system was evil and exploitative. At the same time, Soviet officials were meeting quietly with De Beers representatives, negotiating terms for diamond sales, accepting payments that flowed into Soviet accounts. De Beers was simultaneously doing business with anti-communist dictatorships in Africa and with the communist superpower itself. Ideology meant nothing. The cartel meant everything. De Beers paid a premium for Soviet diamonds, more than they would have paid on an open market. This premium was the price of keeping Soviet stones out of independent channels, of maintaining the single-channel system that gave De Beers control over global prices. The Soviets accepted this premium happily. They received above-market value for their production, without having to build their own marketing and distribution networks. Both sides benefited from cooperation. Competition would have harmed both. The deal lasted through the entire remainder of the Cold War, through Soviet invasions, through American proxy wars, through nuclear standoffs, through every moment of tension between the superpowers. It continued after the Soviet collapse, with De Beers negotiating new arrangements with the Russian Federation. Diamonds transcended geopolitics. The cartel was more durable than the communist system itself. All of this, the African dictatorships, the Soviet arrangements, The willingness to deal with anyone who controlled diamonds came at a cost that rarely appeared in financial statements: the human cost. Maintaining the cartel required looking away from atrocities. It required pretending not to notice how diamonds were extracted, under what conditions, by whom, at what price in human suffering. In Zaire, diamond miners worked in conditions that bordered on slavery. In Angola, civilians died in wars funded partly by diamond revenues. In Sierra Leone, rebel groups would soon begin amputating limbs of villagers in campaigns financed by diamond sales. De Beers did not directly cause these horrors, but De Beers created the market conditions that made diamonds valuable enough to fight over, and De Beers purchased diamonds without examining too carefully where they came from or what had been done to obtain them. The company maintained plausible deniability through layers of intermediaries, buying from traders who bought from smugglers who bought from armed groups. The blood on the diamonds was always someone else's responsibility. African workers who extracted the diamonds that made Oppenheimer wealth possible remained desperately poor. Mining communities saw their land destroyed, their water poisoned, their traditional ways of life ended, and received in return wages that barely sustained life. The value created by African resources flowed out of Africa, to London vaults, to Western consumers, to Oppenheimer accounts. This was extraction in its most literal form, pulling wealth from the earth and from African societies, leaving behind depleted landscapes and impoverished populations. Western consumers who purchased diamond engagement rings, who celebrated love with stones pulled from African soil, never saw any of this. They saw sparkling gems in jewelry store displays. They saw advertisements featuring happy couples and romantic proposals. They experienced the manufactured tradition that De Beers had created, the emotional associations with love and commitment, and forever. The supply chain that brought those diamonds from African mine to Western finger was invisible, deliberately so. De Beers had no interest in customers knowing how diamonds actually reached the market. By 1980, Harry Oppenheimer had expanded and consolidated the empire his father built until it dominated not just the diamond industry, but significant portions of the entire South African economy. Anglo-American alone controlled companies representing perhaps a quarter of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. The family fortune had grown to billions of dollars. Harry was one of the wealthiest individuals on earth, his assets spread across mining, industry, finance, and real estate onto multiple continents. The Oppenheimers established philanthropic foundations, donated to universities, funded medical research, supported the arts. This was the standard pattern of monopolists throughout history. Create wealth through extraction and domination, then rehabilitate reputation through generosity. The Rockefellers did it with oil money. The Carnegies did it with steel money. The Oppenheimers did it with diamond money. The foundations and hospitals and scholarships bearing their name helped obscure the origins of the fortune, transformed extractors into benefactors, made it possible to speak of the Oppenheimers as public-spirited rather than exploitative. But the darkest chapter of the Oppenheimer diamond empire was not in distant African dictatorships. It was at home, in South Africa, where the family that controlled the world's diamonds was building its fortune on the foundation of apartheid, and would spend decades navigating between profit and moral catastrophe. The Oppenheimers were not just witnesses to apartheid, they were its beneficiaries. Their mines ran on cheap black labour, their profits depended on a system that denied basic humanity to millions, and yet they would eventually be credited with helping end it. In 1948, the National Party won control of South Africa's government on a platform of racial separation. The policy they called apartheid, an Afrikaans word meaning apartness, would formalise and intensify racial oppression that had existed in various forms since European colonisation. But apartheid was not merely about separation. It was an economic system designed to extract maximum labour from black South Africans at minimum cost. Every element of apartheid legislation, the pass laws, the homelands, the job reservation, the restrictions on movement and residence and employment, served to create a captive workforce that had no choice but to accept whatever wages and conditions white employers offered. The mining industry sat at the heart of this system. South Africa's economy depended on minerals, gold and diamonds above all else. Extracting those minerals required enormous amounts of labour, hundreds of thousands of workers digging in the earth, processing ore, building infrastructure. White South Africans were too few and too expensive to perform this work. The entire mining economy depended on black labour, and apartheid ensured that black labour would be cheap, controlled, and unable to demand better treatment. The Oppenheimer companies were the largest private employers in South Africa. Anglo-American and De Beers together employed hundreds of thousands of black workers across their mining operations. These workers made the Oppenheimer fortune possible. They descended into shafts, breathed toxic dust, risked death from cave-ins and equipment failures, and received in return wages that were a fraction of what white workers earned for comparable labour. The disparity was not subtle. Black miners might earn 1/10 or 1/20 of white wages. The savings from this differential, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of workers over decades, amounted to billions of dollars. Every dividend paid to Oppenheimer shareholders, every expansion of the family fortune, every philanthropic donation bearing the Oppenheimer name drew on wealth created by this exploitation. The compound system made the exploitation systematic. Mining companies recruited workers from rural areas of South Africa and from neighbouring countries like Mozambique, Lesotho, and Malawi. These workers signed contracts that bound them to the mines for extended periods, typically 9 to 12 months at a time. They were housed in single-sex compounds near the mining operations, barrack-style facilities surrounded by fences, patrolled by security, governed by strict rules. Workers could not bring their families. They could not leave the compound freely. They could not change employers or negotiate conditions. They lived in dormitories, ate in mess halls, slept in bunks, existed in a state somewhere between employee and prisoner. The compound system predated apartheid. Mining companies had developed it in the late 19th century as a method of controlling labour and preventing desertion. But apartheid perfected and protected the system, made it legal, made it normal, made it invisible to white South Africans who benefited from cheap minerals without ever seeing the conditions in which those minerals were produced. De Beers compounds held diamond sorters and processors. Anglo-American compounds held gold miners and machinery operators. Across the Oppenheimer empire, hundreds of thousands of black men lived separated from their wives and children, worked in dangerous conditions, earned poverty wages, and had no legal recourse to demand anything better. The past laws ensured that workers who left the compounds without permission could be arrested. The Bantustans, the nominally independent homelands where the apartheid government dumped black South Africans, ensured that workers had no economic alternatives. The restrictions on black urbanisation ensured that workers could not bring families to live near the mines, even if they could afford to. Every element of the apartheid system reinforced the mining labour model, and the mining industry reinforced apartheid. Here is where the story becomes complicated. Harry Oppenheimer publicly opposed apartheid. He gave speeches criticising the system. He funded opposition movements, including organisations that would later be banned by the government. He established educational programs for black South Africans, created scholarships, supported institutions that trained black professionals. He used his considerable influence to argue for reform, met with government officials to push for changes, and positioned himself as an enlightened businessman who wanted South Africa to move beyond racial oppression. Critics called him a hypocrite. They pointed out that Harry condemned apartheid while his companies profited from it every single day. They noted that his philanthropic gestures were funded by the exploitation he claimed to oppose. They argued that his public criticism was a performance designed to protect his reputation internationally while he continued extracting wealth from a system built on black suffering. How could a man sincerely oppose apartheid while employing hundreds of thousands of workers under apartheid conditions? How could donations to black education compensate for wages that kept black families in poverty? The moral ledger did not balance. Harry defended himself by arguing that he was working within the system to change it. If he withdrew from South Africa, if Anglo-American and De Beers shut down operations, the result would not be the end of apartheid. The result would be that someone else, someone less committed to reform, would take over those operations. Black workers would still be exploited, but there would be no voice within the business community pushing for change. Better to stay engaged, to use influence from inside, to push incrementally toward reform while maintaining the economic power necessary to be heard. This argument contained truth. Harry Oppenheimer did use his position to advocate for change. His funding did support organisations that opposed apartheid. His public stance did create space for other business leaders to express criticism. The argument also contained convenient self-justification. Harry never actually shut down operations, never sacrificed profits for principle, never accepted any cost that would have meaningfully threatened his wealth or control. He criticised apartheid while his companies continued benefiting from it. He funded opposition while his labour practices remained essentially unchanged. The uncomfortable reality is that both perspectives are accurate. Harry Oppenheimer was neither hero nor simple villain. He was a man who opposed an evil system in principle while profiting from it in practice, who wanted South Africa to change without wanting to bear any significant cost for that change, who convinced himself that his complicated position was principled rather than merely self-interested. The numbers tell a story that moral arguments cannot obscure. Apartheid made Oppenheimer companies more profitable than they would have been in a free labour market. The wage differential between black and white workers saved mining companies enormous sums. The restrictions on unionisation prevented labour organising that would have demanded better pay and conditions. The pass laws guaranteed a steady labour supply that could not simply quit and find other work. The entire apartheid system functioned as a subsidy to mining capital, transferring wealth from black workers to white shareholders. Conservative estimates suggest that apartheid saved South African mining companies billions of dollars over the decades of its existence. Anglo-American and De Beers, as the largest mining enterprises, captured the largest share of those savings. Every Oppenheimer charitable foundation, every university endowment, every hospital wing bearing the family name was built with money that would not have existed if black workers had been paid fairly, treated humanely and allowed to organise. This is not speculation about what might have happened. This is arithmetic. The moral weight of that arithmetic cannot be offset by speeches or donations. The 1980s brought increasing pressure on apartheid South Africa. International sanctions restricted trade. Divestment movements pressured universities and corporations to withdraw investments from companies doing business in South Africa. Banks refused to roll over loans. The South African economy, dependent on access to international markets and capital, began to suffer. Anglo-American and De Beers faced this pressure directly. They were the largest South African companies, the most visible symbols of South African business. Activist campaigns targeted them specifically, demanded that investors sell Oppenheimer holdings, organise protests outside their offices. The family faced a choice between their international reputation and their South African operations. Their response was characteristically complex. They restructured corporate holdings to create distance between South African operations and international assets. They made public commitments to reform labour practices. They funded negotiations between the apartheid government and the African National Congress, the liberation movement that had been banned and whose leaders had been imprisoned for decades. Harry Oppenheimer worked behind the scenes to facilitate the transition that everyone could see coming. He met with ANC leaders. He urged government officials to negotiate. He helped create the conditions for the eventual release of Nelson Mandela and the negotiations that would end apartheid. When apartheid finally fell in 1994, when Nelson Mandela became president of a democratic South Africa, the Oppenheimers were positioned not as collaborators with the old regime, but as reformers who had helped bring about change. They had funded the transition. They had supported the negotiations. They had been on the right side of history, or at least on the right side of the history that was being written. The truth was more complicated. The Oppenheimers had profited from apartheid for nearly half a century. They had used black labour under conditions that denied workers basic human dignity. They had accumulated wealth that would never have been possible in a just system. When the system finally changed, they emerged with that wealth intact. The compound system continued operating after apartheid ended, modified but not fundamentally transformed. The wage gaps narrowed but did not close. The Oppenheimer fortune remained one of the largest in Africa, while the black majority remained impoverished. Did the Oppenheimers perpetuate apartheid or help end it? The uncomfortable answer is both. They benefited from the system while it existed. They criticised it while continuing to benefit. They contributed to its demise when change became inevitable. They emerged from the transition with their power and wealth essentially preserved. The black workers who had made that wealth possible emerged with freedom but little else. The land remained in white hands. The capital remained in white hands. The mines remained under white control. The structural inequality that apartheid had created and enforced continued in new forms, no longer legally mandated but economically entrenched. The Oppenheimers survived apartheid with their empire intact. But they could not survive what came next. The cartel that had controlled the diamond market for a century was about to face something it could not buy, absorb, or destroy. A challenge to its very legitimacy that would eventually break the monopoly forever. In 1998, a phrase entered public consciousness that would do more damage to De Beers than a century of competition: blood diamonds. The African civil wars of the 90s were among the most brutal conflicts since World War II. In Sierra Leone, rebels called the Revolutionary United Front waged a campaign of terror that included systematically amputating the hands, arms, and legs of civilians, including children. In Angola, a civil war that had begun during the Cold War continued for decades after its ideological justifications had disappeared. In Liberia, warlords carved out fiefdoms through murder and intimidation. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, a conflict that would eventually kill millions ground on year after year with almost no international attention. These wars shared a common feature. They were financed by diamonds. Rebel groups controlled alluvial diamond deposits, areas where gems could be extracted from riverbeds and soil without expensive mining equipment. They forced local populations to dig for diamonds at gunpoint, murdered those who resisted, and traded the stones for weapons, ammunition, and supplies. The diamonds moved through smuggling networks across porous African borders, entered the legitimate market through corrupt dealers, and eventually reached cutting centres in Antwerp and Tel Aviv and Mumbai, where they were processed alongside stones from legal sources. Once cut and polished, a diamond from a Sierra Leone rebel mine was indistinguishable from a diamond from a legitimate De Beers operation. They entered the same supply chains, sat in the same jewellery store cases, adorned the same engagement rings. The romantic symbol that De Beers had spent decades creating was now connected to some of the worst atrocities of the late 20th century. The same stones that were supposed to represent eternal love had paid for machetes used to chop off children's hands. De Beers claimed that conflict diamonds represented only a small percentage of global production, perhaps 4% at their peak. Critics disputed these numbers and pointed out that De Beers' own purchasing practices had created the conditions for the blood diamond trade. For decades, De Beers had bought diamonds from virtually anyone who offered them, asking few questions about origins. The single-channel system that controlled the legitimate market also provided a destination for illegitimate stones. Smugglers knew that if they could get conflict diamonds to certain dealers, those diamonds would eventually find their way into De Beers' stockpiles, laundered through layers of intermediaries until their bloody origins became untraceable. The 2006 film Blood Diamond, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, brought the issue to mass audiences who had never heard of Sierra Leone or the RUF. The movie depicted the violence of diamond mining regions, the complicity of the international diamond trade, and the human cost hidden behind every sparkling stone. It was Hollywood entertainment, simplified and dramatized, but it planted a question in millions of minds. Where did my diamond come from? What did it cost? Not in money, but in human suffering. De Beers faced a public relations crisis unlike anything in its history. The brand that meant love now carried associations with murder. The marketing machine that had convinced generations that diamonds were essential to romance now had to convince consumers that their purchases were not funding atrocities. The industry response was the Kimberley Process Certification Scheme, launched in 2003 after years of negotiations involving governments, diamond companies, and civil society organizations. The scheme required participating countries to certify that diamond exports were conflict-free, to maintain chain of custody documentation, and to exclude diamonds from non-participating countries. De Beers championed the Kimberley process publicly, positioning itself as a responsible industry leader committed to ending the trade in conflict diamonds. The reality was considerably less impressive. Critics pointed out that the Kimberley process was designed with loopholes large enough to drive truckloads of conflict diamonds through. The definition of conflict diamond was narrow, covering only stones that funded rebel movements against recognized governments. Diamonds that funded government atrocities, that were mined by forced labor, that financed state-sponsored violence did not qualify as conflict diamonds under the official definition. A stone mined by child slaves working for a recognized government was technically Kimberley process compliant. The certification process itself was weak. Certificates could be forged, stones could be smuggled across borders and given fraudulent documentation. Countries with minimal enforcement capacity were trusted to certify their own exports. Once diamonds entered the legitimate supply chain with Kimberley certificates, no further verification occurred. The system depended on trusting the very parties who had financial incentives to cheat. Human rights organizations documented case after case of conflict diamonds entering the certified market. Zimbabwe diamonds mined by the military units that had massacred civilians received Kimberley certification. Stones from conflict zones in Central African Republic flowed through neighbouring countries and emerged with clean paperwork. The Kimberley process provided the appearance of accountability without the substance. It allowed the diamond industry to claim it had addressed the problem while the problem continued. De Beers received credit for supporting the certification scheme while continuing to benefit from a system that did not actually prevent conflict diamonds from reaching consumers. This was reputation laundering rather than real reform. While public pressure mounted over blood diamonds, legal pressure was building from another direction entirely. American antitrust authorities had been aware for decades that De Beers operated an illegal price-fixing cartel. The single-channel system, the coordinated supply restrictions, the agreements with competitors to maintain prices, all of this violated American antitrust law. But De Beers had carefully structured its operations to avoid American jurisdiction. The company did not directly sell in the United States. It operated through intermediaries, maintained no American offices, and ensured that its executives never set foot on American soil where they could be arrested. For years, De Beers executives were effectively banned from entering the United States. They could not attend industry conferences in New York, could not meet with American clients, could not vacation in American cities without risking arrest. This was an extraordinary situation, one of the world's largest companies unable to operate normally in the world's largest economy because its business model was criminally illegal there. In 2004, De Beers finally reached a settlement with American authorities. The company pleaded guilty to criminal price-fixing charges and paid a $10 million fine. The amount was trivial for a company with billions in annual revenue. But the symbolic significance was enormous. De Beers had admitted in court that its business model was illegal. The cartel that had operated openly for nearly a century was formally acknowledged to be a criminal enterprise. Class action lawsuits followed. American consumers who had purchased diamonds at artificially inflated prices sued for damages. In 2012, De Beers settled these cases for $295 million, a more substantial sum that nonetheless represented a fraction of the profits the company had extracted through decades of price manipulation. The legal system had finally held De Beers partially accountable, but only partially. No executives went to prison. The fines were absorbed as a cost of doing business. The fundamental wrong, generations of consumers paying inflated prices for artificially scarce stones, was never fully remedied. The legal and public relations crises accelerated a market transformation that was already underway. New diamond sources had emerged that De Beers could not control. The Russian company Alrosa, successor to the Soviet diamond operations, had maintained a degree of independence from the De Beers system. After the Soviet collapse, Alrosa began selling more diamonds outside De Beers channels, reducing the cartel's control over a major production source. Australia's Argyle mine, which produced unusual pink and brown diamonds, began selling directly to manufacturers rather than through the central selling organisation. Canadian diamond mines, developed in the 1990s and 2000s, explicitly marketed themselves as conflict-free alternatives to African stones, creating a differentiated product category that did not depend on De Beers distribution. The internet transformed diamond retail. Online dealers offered price transparency that the traditional industry had always prevented. Consumers could compare prices, research quality grades, and purchase stones without going through the controlled site holder system. The information asymmetry that had allowed De Beers to maintain artificial prices began to collapse. De Beers' market share, which had peaked at roughly 90%, fell to under 40% by the 2010s. The single-channel system that Ernest Oppenheimer had created could not survive in a world with multiple independent producers, informed consumers, and global scrutiny. The cartel was not destroyed by any single blow. It was eroded by dozens of pressures, legal challenges, public relations disasters, new competitors, changing technology, shifting consumer preferences. The monopoly that had seemed permanent proved surprisingly fragile when the conditions that sustained it changed. In 2001, De Beers was taken private. The Oppenheimer family and the Anglo-American corporation bought out public shareholders, removing the company from stock exchange scrutiny and quarterly reporting requirements. This allowed De Beers to restructure away from public view to adapt its business model without explaining each change to outside investors. The privatization was a defensive move, a retreat from exposure to a more protected position. A decade later came the final break. In 2011, Anglo-American purchased the Oppenheimer family's 40% stake in De Beers for $5.1 billion. After more than a century, the Oppenheimers no longer controlled the company that Ernest had spent his life building. Nicky Oppenheimer, Harry's son and Ernest's grandson, retained a seat on the board but no longer held the power that 3 generations of his family had exercised. The Diamond dynasty had ended. The family walked away with billions, their fortune intact, their legacy secured in foundations and trusts that would continue for generations. But the empire they had built, the cartel that had controlled global diamond supply, the marketing machine that had manufactured desire, the system that had extracted wealth from African soil and African labour, all of it passed out of Oppenheimer hands. De Beers continued operating, but as a fundamentally different kind of company. Without monopoly control, it could no longer dictate prices. Without the single-channel system, it could no longer determine who received diamonds and on what terms. The company pivoted from supply control to brand marketing. A diamond is forever remained valuable intellectual property, but it was now just a slogan for one company among many, rather than a message that benefited a monopolist controlling all supply. De Beers opened its own retail stores, competing directly with the site holders who had been its customers for generations. It invested in brand building, in advertising, in the consumer perception of De Beers as a luxury name. The company that had never needed to market itself because it controlled the entire market now had to compete for consumer attention, like any other luxury brand. The transition from cartel to conventional company was a kind of defeat. De Beers remained large and profitable, but it had lost the structural advantages that made it unique. It was now subject to competitive pressures it had avoided for a century. It had to innovate, to respond to consumer preferences, to match competitor prices. The era of effortless dominance through supply control was finished. The Oppenheimer Diamond dynasty lasted 85 years, from Ernest's arrival in Kimberley in 1902 to the family's exit from De Beers in 2011. They had controlled the most successful cartel in modern history, manufactured one of the most powerful cultural myths of the 20th century, and accumulated billions while Africa remained poor. But what is their legacy? And what does the diamond on your finger actually mean? The Oppenheimer family is still one of the wealthiest in Africa. Their foundation funds education, conservation and healthcare across the continent. And every day, millions of people still buy diamonds believing in traditions the family invented. Nicky Oppenheimer, grandson of Ernest and son of Harry, remains the public face of the family legacy. After selling the De Beers stake in 2011, he invested the proceeds across a diversified portfolio that includes private equity, real estate, technology ventures, and luxury tourism. The family wealth is estimated at over $8 billion, though the private nature of their holdings makes precise accounting impossible. They own game reserves in Botswana, properties across multiple continents, stakes in companies that have nothing to do with diamonds. The fortune that Ernest built through opium-like control of a global commodity has been transformed into the kind of diversified wealth that regenerates itself across generations, insulated from the rise or fall of any single industry. The Oppenheimer Memorial Trust and related foundations distribute tens of millions of dollars annually to causes across Africa. They fund scholarships that send Black South African students to universities. They support conservation programs protecting endangered wildlife. They build clinics in rural areas that lack basic healthcare. The philanthropic work is genuine and substantial, employing professionals who care deeply about their missions, achieving real improvements in real lives. It is also inevitably reputation laundering. The foundations bear the Oppenheimer name. Every school they build, every student they educate, every rhino they protect carries that name forward into the future. The wealth extracted from African labour over more than a century is being returned in carefully measured doses, each donation burnishing the family image, each grant transforming extractors into benefactors. This is not unique to the Oppenheimers. Every great fortune accumulated through exploitation eventually establishes foundations. The Rockefellers did it. The Carnegies did it. The pattern is so consistent it might as well be a natural law. First you take, then you give. The giving never matches the taking, but it changes how history remembers you. The Oppenheimers will be remembered for their philanthropy by people who never learn about the compound system or the blood diamonds, trade or the apartheid profiteering. That is the point. The most remarkable aspect of the Oppenheimer legacy is not the family itself, but the cultural artifact they created. The diamond engagement ring remains standard practice throughout the Western world and increasingly beyond it. The tradition that did not exist in 1938, that was manufactured from nothing by an advertising agency working for a South African mining cartel, is now so deeply embedded in culture that questioning it seems eccentric or even offensive. Suggest to a newly engaged couple that diamond rings are a marketing invention and watch their reaction. They know intellectually that you might be right. The information is widely available. Books have been written about the De Beers campaigns, documentaries have exposed the manipulation. The facts are not hidden, and yet the tradition continues. Why? Because manufactured traditions become real traditions once enough people participate in them. The diamond ring your grandmother wore was purchased under the influence of De Beers advertising. The diamond ring your mother wore was purchased because your grandmother had worn one, and because the tradition seemed established. The diamond ring you wear or will give is shaped by generations of accumulated practice that feel like timeless custom regardless of their actual origins. We know it is artificial and participate anyway. This is the deepest achievement of the De Beers marketing machine. They did not merely manipulate one generation, they created a self-perpetuating cultural practice that continues without ongoing effort. The advertising campaigns have faded. The slogans are no longer repeated with the same intensity. De Beers no longer controls the market. And yet the diamond engagement ring remains standard because it has become what it was designed to simulate, an actual tradition maintained by social expectation and accumulated meaning. The 2-month salary rule still circulates in wedding planning guides and jewelry store conversations, stated as fact rather than marketing invention. Diamonds are forever still resonates as wisdom about love rather than as a slogan designed to prevent resale. The visual vocabulary of proposals, man kneeling, box opening, stone sparkling, woman gasping, remains the template against which real proposals are measured. Cultural programming is permanent once established. It becomes part of the substrate of shared assumptions that we do not question, because questioning would require questioning too much else. The costs of the diamond trade have not disappeared even as the monopoly has weakened. Diamond mining communities across Africa remain impoverished, while the stones they unearth sell for thousands of dollars in Western markets. The Democratic Republic of Congo still suffers from resource curse dynamics, where mineral wealth fuels conflict rather than development. Angola still struggles with the legacy of a diamond-funded civil war. Sierra Leone still bears the scars of atrocities financed by gems. The fundamental pattern, wealth extracted from African soil by African labour and exported to enrich foreign corporations and consumers, continues in modified forms. De Beers is no longer a monopoly. Independent producers now operate throughout the market. But the structural relationship between African mining communities and global diamond consumers has not fundamentally changed. The miners remain poor, the consumers remain unaware, the profits still flow from south to north. Lab-grown diamonds now present an existential challenge to the natural diamond industry. Technology has advanced to the point where synthetic diamonds are chemically, physically, and optically identical to mined stones. They cost a fraction of the natural price. They involve no mining, no African labour conditions, no blood diamond risks. They are, by any rational measure, the superior product for consumers who want a sparkly stone without the ethical complications. De Beers has responded to this threat by doing exactly what competitors once did to De Beers, marketing natural diamonds as more authentic, more meaningful, more valuable than the alternative. The company that manufactured desire for mined diamonds is now manufacturing contempt for lab-grown stones. The company that created artificial scarcity through supply control is now arguing that artificial diamonds lack the authenticity of naturally scarce gems. There is irony in this that requires no commentary. The Oppenheimer story raises questions that have no comfortable answers. Can traditions manufactured through manipulation become real and meaningful? The diamond engagement ring suggests they can. The practice has genuine emotional significance for millions of people who do not care about its origins. Meaning is not diminished by understanding where it came from. Or perhaps it is, and we prefer not to understand. Is there such thing as ethical consumption in a global economy built on extraction and inequality? Every purchase connects us to supply chains we do not see, to labour conditions we would not accept, to environmental damage we would not tolerate if it happened in our neighbourhoods. Diamonds are unusual only in that the exploitation has been documented and publicised. Similar dynamics exist for smartphones, for clothing, for chocolate, for virtually every product that crosses borders from poor countries to rich ones. Focusing on diamonds may simply be a way of feeling ethical about one purchase while remaining oblivious to all the others. How do we judge historical figures who operated within systems we now recognise as unjust? Ernest Oppenheimer was not uniquely evil. He operated within the legal and moral frameworks of his time, building a business that contemporaries considered legitimate. The apartheid system that Harry exploited was created by governments, supported by majorities, maintained by institutions far beyond any single family. Condemning the Oppenheimers specifically risks absolving the broader systems that enabled them, and that continue enabling similar extraction today. What do we owe to communities whose exploitation funded our luxuries? This question has no answer that does not implicate the person asking. If you wear a diamond, or benefit from wealth accumulated in economies that consume diamonds, or participate in cultural practices shaped by diamond marketing, you are connected to the system that impoverished African mining communities. The connection may be attenuated, may involve many intermediaries, may feel too abstract to be morally significant, but it exists. And the question of what that connection demands remains open. The ring on your finger, or the ring you will give, or the ring you expect to receive, what does it actually mean? Does it mean love, commitment, forever, the traditional meanings that feel natural regardless of their origin? Does it mean participation in a manufactured tradition, knowing complicity in a cultural construction? Does it mean connection to African labourers who dug the stone from the earth, to colonial systems that enabled extraction, to a cartel that manipulated desire for profit? Does it mean all of these things simultaneously, layers of significance that cannot be separated into clean categories of authentic and artificial, ethical and exploitative? The Oppenheimers did not just sell diamonds, they sold an idea that love could be measured in carats, that forever could be captured in a stone. That tradition was ancient when it was only decades old. They were brilliant at it, perhaps the most successful salespeople in human history. The question is, knowing what you now know, what do you want that ring on your finger to mean?